In 1915, deep in the Missouri Ozarks, a young girl shocked an entire town, and soon the world. At just 12 years old, Clara Caldwell displayed a level of intelligence so advanced that doctors, teachers, and scientists had only one question: how is this even possible? Some called her a prodigy. Others believed something supernatural was at play. But one thing was certain: Clara Caldwell was a mystery science couldn't explain. Before we uncover the unbelievable story behind her genius, make sure you hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's step into the Ozarks of 1915. In the winter of 1915, deep in the Ozark Mountains of Missouri, a 12-year-old girl walked into the office of Dr. Harrison Webb, a physician who had practiced medicine for 37 years. What she told him in the next 20 minutes would shake the foundations of everything he thought he knew about the human mind. Her name was Clara Caldwell, and by the time the sun set that evening, 3 professors, 2 journalists, and the county sheriff would be standing in that same office demanding answers to questions no one could formulate properly. This is the story of Clara Caldwell, a story buried in county records, hidden in university archives, whispered about in academic circles for decades before being deliberately forgotten. What you are about to hear happened. The documents exist. The witnesses testified. The evidence was collected, cataloged, and then locked away. For over a century, this case has remained one of the most thoroughly documented yet least discussed incidents in American scientific history. Until now. The morning of January 14th, 1915 began like any other morning in Taney County, Missouri. Temperature 14 degrees Fahrenheit. The ground was frozen solid. The war in Europe dominated newspaper headlines, though it seemed impossibly distant to the farmers and merchants of this rural mountain community. Population, approximately 3,000 souls, scattered across hollows and ridges, connected by dirt roads that turned to impassable mud every spring. Dr. Harrison Webb's office sat above the general store on Main Street in Forsyth, the county seat. Webb was 61 years old. He had delivered most of the children in the county. He had treated everything from influenza to gunshot wounds. He had pronounced death on more occasions than he cared to remember. He was, by all accounts, unshakable, methodical, scientific in his approach, despite practicing in a region where folk remedies and superstition still held considerable sway. His morning appointment book shows 3 scheduled visits: Mrs. Patterson for her recurring headaches, young Billy Morse for a persistent cough, and at 10 o'clock, a notation that simply reads, "Caldwell Girl. Assessment." The Caldwell family lived 7 miles outside of Forsyth, up a hollow road that became barely passable in a winter. Thomas Caldwell, age 44, worked a small farm, 30 acres of rocky hillside that yielded just enough corn and beans to keep the family fed. His wife, Martha, age 39, took in sewing and kept a garden that neighbors described as remarkably productive, given the poor soil. They had 3 children: Robert, age 16, Clara, age 12, and Daniel, age 8. By every account, they were an unremarkable family. Quiet, kept to themselves, but not hermits. They attended the Baptist church most Sundays. They paid their debts. Thomas Caldwell drank moderately, worked hard, and was known as a man of few words. Martha was described as kind but reserved. The children were healthy, well-behaved, and clean, which was more than could be said for many farm families struggling through that particular winter. Nothing about them suggested what was about to unfold. Dr. Webb's journal, preserved in the Missouri Historical Society archives, provides our most detailed account of that first meeting. He wrote it the same evening while the events were still fresh. His handwriting shows unusual agitation. Words are crossed out. Entire sentences rewritten. This was a man trying to make sense of something that defied his understanding. The entry begins. This morning, I examined Clara Caldwell at the request of her father, who expressed concerns about his daughter's recent behavior. What I discovered has left me profoundly disturbed and questioning the limits of medical science as I understand it. Clara arrived with both parents at precisely 10 o'clock. Webb noted that she appeared healthy. Clear eyes, good color, normal respiratory function. Height, 4 feet 9 inches. Weight, approximately 85 pounds. She wore a simple cotton dress, wool coat, and boots that were too large for her, likely hand-me-downs from an older cousin. Thomas Caldwell spoke first. He was agitated, according to Webb's notes. He kept his hat in his hands, turning it nervously. Martha Caldwell sat with her hands folded in her lap, saying nothing, her face described as carefully blank. Thomas began by apologizing for taking up the doctor's time. Then he said something that Webb recorded word for word, underlining it twice. Doctor, my daughter can see inside people, inside their bodies. She can tell you what's wrong with them just by looking. Webb's immediate assumption was that the girl had made some lucky guesses, perhaps combined with overheard adult conversations about neighbors' ailments. He had seen this before. Children seeking attention, parents wanting to believe their offspring were special. He prepared to give his standard reassurance. The girl was bright, imaginative, and perfectly normal. Then Thomas Caldwell said, She told me 3 days ago that I had a growth in my stomach. She said it was the size of a walnut and it was dark red, almost black. She drew me a picture of exactly where it was. He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket and placed it on Webb's desk. The drawing was crude but detailed. It showed a stomach with reasonable anatomical accuracy, far more than a 12-year-old farm girl with no formal education beyond 3rd grade should possess. And there, on the greater curvature of the stomach, was a dark mass carefully shaded with dimensions noted beside it. Webb examined Thomas Caldwell. The man showed no external symptoms. He claimed he felt fine, perhaps a little tired lately, but nothing concerning. No pain. No blood in his stool. No vomiting. His appetite was normal. Webb then asked to speak with Clara alone. Thomas and Martha hesitated. In 1915, it was unusual for a man to speak privately with someone's young daughter, even a doctor. But Webb's reputation was impeccable, and they eventually agreed, stepping into the waiting area outside his office. What happened in the next 13 minutes, Webb notes the time precisely, would change everything. Webb began gently, asking Clara about school, her family, her daily routine. She answered in a soft voice, making occasional eye contact but mostly studying her hands. She seemed anxious but not frightened, embarrassed perhaps by the attention. Then Webb asked her directly, Clara, your father says you can see things inside people's bodies. Can you tell me about that? The girl was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I don't want to. Webb asked why. Because nobody believes me, and it scares Mama. Webb assured her that he wouldn't judge her, that he was trying to understand, that she wasn't in trouble. Standard physician's approach to a nervous patient. He expected a child's fantasy, an elaborate story influenced by overheard conversations, or perhaps something she'd seen in a book. What he got was completely different. Clara looked up at him and said, "You have a problem with your left eye. There's a cloud growing there, on the inside, like milk spilling into water. It's making everything blurry on that side, especially when you read at night. In about 2 years, you won't be able to see from that eye at all, unless someone cuts it out." Webb sat very still. He had not told anyone, not even his wife, about the vision problems he'd been experiencing. The blurriness in his left eye had begun 4 months earlier. He'd attributed it to age, to long hours reading medical text by lamplight. He had told no one because he was afraid of the answer. Cataracts ran in his family. His own father had gone blind in one eye by age 65. Clara continued, "It's shaped like a crescent moon right now, attached at the top. The bottom part is getting thicker. It's not a cataract like you're thinking, it's something different." Webb's journal entry at this point becomes difficult to read. His handwriting deteriorates. He writes, "I asked her how she could possibly know this. She said, and I quote exactly, 'I can see it. When I look at people, I can see inside them. It's like they're made of glass, but only if I concentrate. I don't want to do it because once I see something wrong, I can't unsee it." Webb tried a different approach. He asked Clara to describe what she saw when she looked at him. His entire body, not just his eye. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if the ability was easier without the distraction of his actual face. Then she began to speak. She described his cardiovascular system in remarkable detail. She mentioned a twist in one of the arteries near his heart. Webb would later identify this as a probable atherosclerotic plaque. She noted that his left kidney appeared darker than his right, and that there was sand collecting in it, likely an early-stage kidney stone. She mentioned his lungs were clear except for some scarring in the upper right lobe, which Webb knew was from a bout of pneumonia he'd suffered 20 years earlier. But the detail that made Webb's hands shake as he wrote in his journal. Clara told him that he had broken his left wrist when he was 9 years old, and it had healed slightly crooked. She could see where the bone had mended wrong, creating a small bump that would ache in cold weather. This was true. Webb had fallen from a horse at age 9. The wrist had indeed healed with a slight deformity. It did ache when the temperature dropped. But this was information that no one in Taney County could possibly know. Webb had grown up in Pennsylvania. He had moved to Missouri at age 28. He had never discussed his childhood injuries with anyone in town. Webb made a decision that would set everything else in motion. Instead of dismissing the girl or attributing her statements to coincidence, he chose to test her further. He went to the waiting room and asked Thomas and Martha to return to the office. Then he did something that would appear in multiple newspaper accounts over the following weeks. He sent word to Dr. Richard Foster, a colleague who practiced on the other side of town, asking him to come immediately and to bring any patients currently in his waiting room. Within 30 minutes, Dr. Foster arrived with 3 people. An elderly woman named Mrs. Gladys Whitmore, and a middle-aged carpenter named Samuel Beck, and Foster's own nurse, Miss Elizabeth Harrington. What followed was witnessed by both physicians, both parents, and the 3 volunteers, all of whom would later provide sworn statements. Webb asked Clara if she would be willing to look at these strangers and tell him what she saw. Clara looked frightened. She asked if she had to. Her mother spoke for the first time, saying softly, "Tell the truth, Clara. That's all anyone wants." Clara started with Mrs. Whitmore. The elderly woman stood near the window, afternoon light streaming around her. Clara stared at her for perhaps 30 seconds, then turned to Dr. Webb and said, "Her heart is working too hard. It's bigger than it should be, and the walls are thick. The blood isn't moving through it right. It's like trying to pump honey instead of water. Dr. Foster stepped forward. Mrs. Whitmore has been my patient for 6 years. She suffers from what I've diagnosed as chronic heart failure with probable valvular disease. The girl's description, while crude, is essentially accurate. Clara then described a mass in the woman's right breast, something Mrs. Whitmore had not yet disclosed to either physician. The elderly woman went pale and admitted she had felt a lump, but had been too frightened to mention it. Next was Samuel Beck, the carpenter. Clara studied him and said, "He broke his ankle badly years ago. It didn't set right. That's why he limps when he's tired. But that's not the main problem. He has pieces of metal inside his right leg. Splinters. They're working their way toward the surface. 3 of them. They'll need to come out soon or the skin will get infected." Beck stared at the girl. Then he slowly rolled up his pant leg. His calf showed several small, inflamed areas. He said, "I got caught in a thresher accident 7 years back. They pulled out most of the metal, but I've always felt like there was more in there. These spots started getting red and sore about 2 weeks ago." Dr. Foster examined the leg. "She's correct. These appear to be foreign objects working their way out through the skin." The final test involved Miss Elizabeth Harrington, Dr. Foster's nurse. She was 26 years old, unmarried, and by all accounts in perfect health. She volunteered cheerfully, expecting the girl to find nothing of interest. Clara looked at her for a long time. Her expression changed. She looked confused, then concerned. She turned to Dr. Webb and whispered, "Can I tell you privately?" Webb agreed. He and Clara stepped to the far corner of the office, away from the others. The room was small enough that several witnesses later reported being able to hear fragments of the conversation, though not the complete exchange. Clara told Webb something that made him immediately dismiss everyone except Dr. Foster. Once the room was clear except for the 2 physicians, Clara's parents and Miss Harrington, Webb asked Clara to repeat what she had said. According to Webb's journal, Clara said, "There's a baby inside her. It's very small, maybe the size of my thumb. It's in the wrong place, though. It's not in the womb. It's in one of the tubes. It's going to break soon, maybe in a few days. When it does, she'll bleed inside and she could die." Miss Harrington denied any possibility of pregnancy. She insisted she was not involved with any man. But Dr. Webb, following proper medical protocol, asked if he could examine her. She agreed, and Martha Caldwell was asked to remain as a chaperone while the examination was conducted behind a privacy screen. What Webb found and what he documented carefully in his medical notes was a slightly enlarged uterus and tenderness on the right side, consistent with an ectopic pregnancy. Miss Harrington's last monthly cycle had been irregular and lighter than usual, which she had attributed to stress. Webb told her that based on Clara's statement and his own examination, he believed there was a serious risk of an ectopic pregnancy. He recommended she be taken immediately to Springfield, the nearest hospital capable of surgical intervention, for confirmation and possible emergency surgery. Miss Harrington began to cry. She admitted, only to Dr. Webb and with Martha Caldwell present, that she had been secretly engaged to a man from a neighboring county. They had planned to marry in the spring. She had suspected she might be pregnant, but had been too frightened and ashamed to seek medical attention. Dr. Foster arranged for immediate transport to Springfield. 3 days later, on January 17th, 1915, Elizabeth Harrington underwent emergency surgery. The surgeon's report, preserved in hospital records, confirms ruptured ectopic pregnancy in the right fallopian tube. The surgery saved her life. By the time news of this reached Forsyth, Clara Caldwell's name was already spreading through the county. News traveled slowly in rural Missouri in 1915, but it traveled completely. Within 48 hours, Dr. Webb's office was besieged by people wanting to see the girl who could diagnose disease by looking at them. The Caldwell family's home was visited by neighbors, by strangers, by people traveling from as far as 50 miles away. Thomas Caldwell tried to protect his daughter. He turned people away. He refused to allow her to be exhibited or tested further. But the pressure continued to build. On January 20th, Professor Martin Ashcroft arrived from the University of Missouri in Columbia. He was 53 years old, a professor of psychology and one of the Midwest's leading experts on mental phenomena, suggestion, and what was then called abnormal psychology. He had studied in Vienna. He had corresponded with William James. He had investigated dozens of cases of alleged psychic ability, mediums, and mental prodigies. He had never found one he couldn't explain through fraud, suggestion, or simple misunderstanding. He came to debunk Clara Caldwell. Ashcroft brought with him a colleague, Dr. Edmund Price, a physician who taught at the university's medical school. They also brought standardized testing materials, medical instruments, and a detailed experimental protocol designed to eliminate any possibility of fraud or lucky guessing. Thomas Caldwell initially refused to let them see Clara. He said his daughter was exhausted and frightened by all the attention, but Professor Ashcroft made him an offer. Allow a systematic scientific examination under controlled conditions, and he would publish whatever he found in academic journals. If Clara's ability was real, it would be documented properly. If it was an elaborate hoax or psychological phenomenon, that would be documented too. Either way, the circus would end. Martha Caldwell convinced her husband to agree. The testing would take place over 3 days in a borrowed room at the Forsyth courthouse, away from the Caldwell home and away from Dr. Webb's office. Multiple witnesses would be present. Every test would be documented. Everything would be done according to scientific protocol. Clara was terrified. The first day of testing began on January 22nd, 1915 at 9 o'clock in the morning. Present were Professor Ashcroft, Dr. Price, Dr. Webb, Dr. Foster, County Sheriff William McCready, there to ensure no disruption. Clara's parents and a stenographer named Miss Judith Carroll hired to create a verbatim transcript of all proceedings. The transcript runs to 307 pages. It has never been fully published. Professor Ashcroft began with standard psychological assessments. He tested Clara's intelligence, her memory, her ability to read emotions from faces, her suggestibility. He asked her to describe how her ability worked, when it had first appeared, whether she could control it. Clara was quiet and nervous. She gave short answers, but the picture that emerged was consistent and detailed. She said the ability had first appeared approximately 18 months earlier, in the summer of 1913 when she was 11 years old. She had been helping her mother can vegetables in their kitchen. Her younger brother Daniel had been playing outside. Clara had looked out the window at him and suddenly she struggled to describe it. It was as if she could see through his skin. She could see his bones, his organs, the blood moving through his veins. It had terrified her. She had screamed. The vision had vanished. She told no one because she thought she was going insane. Over the following months, according to Clara's testimony, the ability had come and gone without pattern. Sometimes she could trigger it by concentrating. Sometimes it happened spontaneously. She learned to suppress it most of the time because what she saw often frightened her. She described seeing her father's internal injury, the stomach growth, during dinner one evening in early January. The vision had been so vivid and disturbing that she had dropped her fork and run from the table. Later that night, unable to sleep, she had drawn the picture to try to make sense of what she had seen. The next morning, she had shown it to her father. Professor Ashcroft asked, "Can you see inside everyone?" Clara, "Yes, if I look hard enough." Ashcroft, "Can you see inside yourself?" Clara, "Yes, that's the worst part." Ashcroft, "What do you mean?" Clara, "I can see everything that's wrong with me too. Things that might go wrong someday. It's like knowing when you're going to die." The formal testing began after lunch on that first day. Professor Ashcroft and Dr. Price had arranged for 15 volunteers, people Clara had never met and about whom she had no prior information. They came from Springfield, from other counties, even one from as far as St. Louis. Each had been medically examined in advance by Dr. Price. Each had documented medical conditions of varying severity. The protocol was simple. Each volunteer would enter the room one at a time. Clara would have 5 minutes to examine them visually. No touching, no conversation beyond basic greetings. She would then describe to the panel what, if anything, was medically wrong with the person. The first volunteer was a man named George Pritchard, age 47, a telegraph operator from Springfield. Clara studied him for approximately 2 minutes, then said, "His right lung is damaged. The bottom part is hard and scarred. He has trouble breathing when he walks upstairs. He coughs at night." Dr. Price consulted his notes. Mr. Pritchard suffered from tuberculosis 11 years ago. His right lower lobe shows significant scarring and reduced function. He does experience shortness of breath with exertion and occasional night cough. The girl is correct. The second volunteer was Mrs. Helen Patterson, age 32, who had traveled from St. Louis specifically for this test. Clara looked at her and almost immediately said, "She's losing her vision. Both eyes. There's pressure building up inside them. It's like they're too full. The pressure is damaging the nerves in the back." Dr. Price. Mrs. Patterson suffers from glaucoma in both eyes, diagnosed 6 months ago. The condition is characterized by increased intraocular pressure causing optic nerve damage. Again, essentially correct, if stated in lay terms. The testing continued through the afternoon. Clara correctly identified a fractured vertebrae in a farmer's lower back that had healed improperly 3 years earlier, kidney stones in a school teacher, a heart murmur in a young woman, liver cirrhosis in a man who had hidden his drinking problem from his family, an ovarian cyst in a minister's wife, and most dramatically, a small brain tumor in a traveling salesman who had been experiencing severe headaches but attributed them to stress. Of the 15 volunteers tested that first day, Clara provided accurate diagnoses, confirmed by prior medical examination, in 14 cases. The one she got wrong was a woman she said was completely healthy, when in fact the woman had a mild case of diabetes. However, the diabetes had been diagnosed only 2 weeks earlier, and Dr. Price admitted the physiological changes might have been too subtle for Clara to detect, whatever her method. The statistical probability of achieving this level of accuracy by chance or lucky guessing was according to Professor Ashcroft's calculations, effectively zero. That evening, Professor Ashcroft wrote in his personal journal, "I came here prepared to expose a fraud or document a case of mass hysteria. Instead, I find myself confronting something I cannot explain." The girl shows no signs of prior medical knowledge. She uses childish language to describe complex pathology, yet her descriptions are anatomically accurate. She shows genuine distress when examining severely ill patients. If this is a performance, it is the most sophisticated fraud I have ever encountered. If it is genuine, it challenges everything I thought I knew about human perception and consciousness. The second day of testing introduced additional controls. Professor Ashcroft brought volunteers who were hidden behind screens, with only their hands or feet visible. Could Clara diagnose conditions in parts of the body she couldn't see? The results were mixed but still remarkable. When shown only a person's hand, Clara correctly identified arthritis in the joints, but could not determine if the person had other conditions elsewhere in their body. She said the screen blocked her vision. She could only see what was directly in front of her. However, when the screen was made of thin muslin fabric instead of wood, she reported being able to see through it a little bit, and correctly identified that the person behind it had an enlarged heart. Dr. Price attempted to test whether Clara was somehow reading micro-expressions or unconscious cues from the patients. He had volunteers deliberately try to mislead her. People with serious conditions acting healthy and cheerful. Healthy people acting sick and pained. Clara's accuracy remained consistent. She could tell, she said, because she was looking at their bodies, not their faces. The most dramatic test of the second day involved something that would become central to later debates about Clara's ability. Could she see inside sealed containers? Dr. Price brought 3 identical wooden boxes, each 12 inches square. One contained a pig's heart with a surgically created defect. One contained a healthy sheep's kidney. One contained a jar of water. Clara examined the boxes by looking at them from different angles. After several minutes, she correctly identified which box contained the pig's heart and accurately described the defect, a puncture wound in the left ventricle. She identified the box with the sheep's kidney, but could not tell it was from a sheep, saying only, "There's an organ in there, something like a bean, it looks healthy." She correctly identified the box with water, saying it was just liquid, nothing alive. The third day of testing took a different direction. Professor Ashcroft wanted to understand the mechanism of Clara's ability. If she could genuinely see through solid objects, this suggested one explanation. If she was somehow sensing physiological information through another means, perhaps an extraordinary sensitivity to heat patterns, electromagnetic fields, or something else science had yet to name, that suggested another explanation entirely. He designed a series of experiments. Some would seem crude by modern standards, but they were at the cutting edge of experimental psychology in 1915. First, could Clara's ability be blocked by specific materials? Tests revealed that she could see through wood, cloth, and glass with varying degrees of clarity. Thin materials were easier than thick ones. Metal completely blocked her vision. She could see nothing through a sheet of iron or copper. Lead was particularly effective at blocking her ability. Second, could her ability be enhanced or diminished by environmental factors? Tests showed that her accuracy decreased when she was tired, hungry, or emotionally distressed. Bright light made it easier for her to concentrate. Complete darkness made it nearly impossible. She needed some ambient light to trigger the ability, even though she insisted she wasn't seeing in the normal sense. Third, could she see living tissue more easily than dead tissue? This test proved fascinating. Clara could easily see details in living patients. When shown organs preserved in formaldehyde, she could see them but describe them as gray and quiet, like they're asleep. Fresh organs that had been removed within hours showed more detail than those that had been dead for longer periods. Professor Ashcroft formed a hypothesis. Clara was somehow perceiving biological activity. The electromagnetic patterns of living cells, the movement of fluids, the chemical processes of metabolism. This was, he admitted, speculative. The science of bioelectricity was in its infancy, but it seemed more plausible than X-ray vision or psychic phenomena. On the afternoon of January 24th, the third day of testing, something happened that Professor Ashcroft had not anticipated. Clara became upset. She had been examined, tested, and questioned for 3 days straight. She was exhausted. She had been separated from her siblings. She had been treated like a laboratory specimen by strangers who, despite their kindness, were clearly more interested in her ability than in her well-being. During a break in testing, Clara broke down crying. She told her mother she didn't want to do this anymore. She said the ability made her feel strange, made her feel like she wasn't normal. She said she hated looking at people and seeing all the things wrong with them, all the ways they were dying. Martha Caldwell told Professor Ashcroft that the testing was over. Her daughter had cooperated fully for 3 days. That was enough. Ashcroft tried to convince her to allow just a few more tests, but Martha was firm. Thomas Caldwell supported his wife. They gathered Clara and prepared to leave. As they were departing, Clara turned to Professor Ashcroft and said something that he recorded in his journal that night. "You have a daughter, don't you? She's sick. Something with her blood. It's not getting better even though the doctors keep trying different medicines." Professor Ashcroft went pale. He did have a daughter, Sarah, age 14. She was home in Colombia, under the care of physicians. She suffered from what doctors had diagnosed as pernicious anemia, a condition that was poorly understood in 1915 and often fatal. The medicines weren't working. Clara continued, "The problem isn't in her blood, it's in her stomach. Something's wrong with how her stomach is working. The blood problem is happening because of that." Then the Caldwell family left. Professor Ashcroft returned to Columbia immediately. He consulted with his daughter's physicians, relaying what Clara had said. The doctors were skeptical but agreed to investigate the digestive angle. Weeks later, they would discover that Sarah Ashcroft was suffering from what we now know as pernicious anemia, caused by an inability to absorb vitamin B12 due to a stomach condition. Treatment focused on addressing the underlying gastric problem would eventually lead to her recovery. Professor Ashcroft never forgot Clara Caldwell. For the rest of his life, he would describe her case as the single most extraordinary thing he had ever witnessed. His formal report, published in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology in June 1915, was carefully worded. He documented the tests. He presented the data. He acknowledged that Clara Caldwell possessed an ability that science could not adequately explain using current theories. He proposed several hypotheses, but admitted none were fully satisfactory. The response from the academic community was swift and divided. Some researchers were fascinated. They wanted to study Clara further to understand her ability to determine if it could be taught or replicated. Several universities extended invitations for Clara to visit their laboratories. There was talk of bringing her to Johns Hopkins, to Harvard, to institutions with more advanced equipment and more prominent researchers. Other academics were hostile. They accused Ashcroft of being duped by a clever fraud. They questioned his methodology, his objectivity, his competence. They suggested that Clara had somehow obtained prior medical knowledge about the test subjects, that the whole thing had been an elaborate conspiracy, that Ashcroft's grief over his sick daughter had made him susceptible to wishful thinking. The Caldwell family refused all invitations and requests. Thomas Caldwell made a statement to the Forsyth newspaper in February 1915. It was brief. "My daughter is not a circus act. She is not a medical curiosity. She is a child who deserves to grow up in peace. We have cooperated with scientific inquiry. We have allowed testing. Now we ask to be left alone." But they would not be left alone. The publicity from Professor Ashcroft's report, combined with newspaper coverage, had made Clara famous far beyond Taney County. Letters arrived at the Caldwell farm from across the country, desperate pleas from sick people or the families of sick people, begging Clara to examine them, to diagnose them, to save them. The letters were heartbreaking. Parents whose children were wasting away from mysterious illnesses. Women with lumps in their breasts who were too poor to afford a doctor. Men with pains they couldn't explain. Every letter represented real human suffering, and the Caldwell family felt the weight of it. Clara told her parents she wanted to help these people. She said she felt guilty for having this ability and not using it. But Martha and Thomas knew what helping would mean. Their daughter would spend the rest of her life being pulled in every direction, never having a normal childhood, never having privacy, never being anything except the girl who can see inside people. They made the decision to protect her rather than to exploit her gift. If gift was the right word for something that caused her so much distress. For several months, the Caldwell family managed to maintain their privacy. The initial wave of publicity died down. Spring arrived, then summer. Clara turned 13. Life returned to something approaching normal, though neighbors still whispered and strangers still occasionally appeared at the farm, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous girl. Then, in August 1915, tragedy struck the Ozarks. A diphtheria outbreak hit Taney County. The disease spread rapidly through the community, hitting children especially hard. Dr. Webb and Dr. Foster worked around the clock, but diphtheria in 1915 was a terrifying killer. The antitoxin existed but was expensive and often in short supply in rural areas. Many children died before treatment could reach them. The outbreak reached the Caldwell farm in late August. 8-year-old Daniel developed the characteristic symptoms: fever, sore throat, the gray membrane forming at the back of the throat that could suffocate victims as it grew. Thomas Caldwell rode through the night to fetch Dr. Webb, but by the time they returned, Daniel was in critical condition. Webb administered what antitoxin he had, but Daniel's case was severe. The boy died on August 29, 1915. The death of her younger brother devastated Clara. Multiple accounts from this period describe her as withdrawn, silent, refusing to eat. She blamed herself. She told her mother that she should have seen Daniel's illness coming, should have been able to prevent it. Martha tried to console her, telling her that diphtheria came on quickly, that even if Clara had sent something wrong, they might not have been able to save him. But Clara was inconsolable. In the weeks after Daniel's death, something changed in Clara. According to statements from her father and from Dr. Webb, who visited the family several times during this period, Clara's ability seemed to intensify. She could no longer fully control it. She would look at people and automatically see their internal conditions, whether she wanted to or not. She told Dr. Webb during one visit that she was drowning in bodies. She said that when she looked at people now, she couldn't see their faces anymore, only their organs, their bones, their blood. She described it as horrifying, claustrophobic, like being trapped inside a medical textbook where every illustration was alive and suffering. Dr. Webb, alarmed by her psychological state, contacted Professor Ashcroft. Ashcroft traveled to Forsyth in September and spent several days with the Caldwell family. His notes from this visit paint a picture of a girl in crisis. Clara described experiencing vivid involuntary visions of disease and death. She would look at her father and see his stomach tumor growing, consuming him slowly. She would look at her mother and see the early signs of arthritis forming in her joints. She would look at herself in a mirror and see her own body as a collection of systems that would eventually fail. Professor Ashcroft wrote, "The girl is experiencing what I can only describe as a form of psychological torture brought on by her own enhanced perception. She cannot unsee what she sees. Every human being she encounters is revealed to her as fundamentally fragile, fundamentally mortal. The weight of this knowledge is crushing her." Professor Ashcroft recommended that Clara be removed from the farm, from the constant presence of sick neighbors and the painful memories associated with her brother's death. He suggested that she might benefit from a period of isolation, not as punishment, but as respite. Somewhere she could be away from people, away from the constant assault of biological information her mind was now processing involuntarily. Thomas and Martha Caldwell faced an impossible decision. Keep Clara at home, where she was clearly suffering, or send her away to strangers. They chose what they thought was a middle path. Martha's sister, Helen Burke, lived alone on a remote property 40 miles away, deep in the wilderness of the Mark Twain National Forest. Helen was a widow, childless, who supported herself through beekeeping and selling honey. Her nearest neighbor was 5 miles distant. It was as close to true isolation as the family could arrange while keeping Clara with someone they trusted. In October 1915, Clara went to stay with her aunt. The letters Clara wrote home during this period, preserved in a private collection and made available to researchers only in 1998, reveal a girl desperately trying to regain control over her own mind. She describes long walks in the forest, where the only living things she encountered were trees, birds, and her aunt's bees. She writes about learning to meditate, to quiet her mind, to look at the world without automatically analyzing everything she saw. She describes the relief of days passing without seeing human suffering. But she also describes profound loneliness and the growing realization that her life would never be normal. In a letter dated November 12, 1915, she writes, "Dear Mama and Papa, I am learning to live with what I can see. Aunt Helen says it's like learning to live with any sense. You must learn what to pay attention to and what to ignore. A person with good hearing doesn't listen to every sound all the time. They learn to filter. I am trying to build a filter in my mind. Some days it works, some days it doesn't. I miss you and Robert. I miss Daniel. I think about him every day. I wonder if I could have saved him if I had looked at him more carefully. I know you said not to think this way, but I cannot help it. With love, Clara." While Clara was attempting to recover in isolation, events continued to unfold that would shape her future. Dr. Webb performed exploratory surgery on Thomas Caldwell in late October. What he found confirmed Clara's diagnosis: a malignant tumor on the stomach wall, advanced and inoperable. Thomas Caldwell was given months to live. Webb wrote to Professor Ashcroft, "The girl was precisely correct in every detail. The tumor is exactly where she indicated, the size she described, the color she specified. I can do nothing except manage his pain as the disease progresses." I find myself wondering, is this ability of hers a gift or a curse? She foresaw her father's death and was powerless to prevent it. What torment that must cause! Thomas Caldwell refused to tell Clara about the surgery or the prognosis. He instructed both Webb and Martha not to inform her. He wanted his daughter to have whatever peace she could find for as long as possible. But Clara already knew. In a letter to her mother dated November 20th, she writes, "Mama, I know about Papa's surgery. I knew before he had it. I've seen that tumor in my dreams. I see it growing every time I close my eyes and think about him. Please tell him I'm not angry that he kept it secret. I understand why. But please also tell him that I love him and I'm grateful for everything he's done to protect me. Tell him I wish I could fix what's wrong inside him, but I can only see. I cannot heal. That's the worst part of all of this. I can see everything that's broken, but I can't repair any of it." Clara returned home in December 1915, just before Christmas. The 3 months with her aunt had helped. She was calmer, more centered. She had developed techniques for managing the involuntary visions, but she was also changed in ways her family found disturbing. Robert Caldwell, her older brother, later described her as hollow. He said she moved through the house like a ghost, speaking little, making no sound. She would sit for hours staring at nothing, or perhaps at everything, seeing through walls, through floors, through the fabric of reality itself into the biological machinery underneath. Thomas Caldwell's health deteriorated through the winter. He tried to hide his pain, to remain strong for his family, but Clara could see everything. She knew when he was suffering, even when he smiled and claimed to feel fine. The pretense must have been agony for both of them. Thomas died on March 3, 1916. He was 45 years old. His death certificate, signed by Dr. Webb, lists the cause as gastric carcinoma, stomach cancer. After her father's death, Clara stopped speaking about her ability entirely. When visitors asked her to examine them, she refused. When Dr. Webb asked if she would be willing to help with difficult diagnoses, she declined. When Professor Ashcroft wrote asking if she would consider additional testing, now that new equipment was available, Martha Caldwell responded on her daughter's behalf. No, never again. The family's financial situation became desperate. Thomas had left no savings. The farm was mortgaged. Martha's sewing brought in barely enough to feed herself and her 2 remaining children. They faced the real possibility of losing their home. It was during this crisis that someone made Clara an offer that would change everything and lead to one of the most controversial chapters in her story. His name was Dr. Vincent Margolis. He was 42 years old, a physician who had trained at prestigious institutions, but whose career had been marked by controversy. He had been dismissed from positions at 3 different hospitals for what administrators described as unorthodox practices and excessive interest in untested treatments. Margolis had read about Clara in Professor Ashcroft's published report. He traveled to Missouri specifically to meet her. He offered Martha Caldwell a proposal. allow Clara to work with him in his private practice in St. Louis. She would examine patients, provide diagnoses, and he would pay her a generous monthly salary, more money than the family could earn any other way. Martha was deeply suspicious. She asked what Margolis's intentions were, whether he planned to exploit Clara for profit or fame. Margolis claimed his interests were purely scientific and humanitarian. He wanted to help people who had been failed by conventional medicine. He wanted to learn from Clara's ability. He promised that Clara would be treated well, that her privacy would be protected, that she could return home whenever she wished. Martha consulted with Dr. Webb and Professor Ashcroft. Webb was cautious but thought Margolis's credentials were legitimate. Ashcroft was more skeptical, noting Margolis's checkered professional history. But both acknowledged that the family needed income and that Clara's ability could indeed help people if used responsibly. Clara herself made the decision. She was 14 years old. She told her mother that she wanted to do this. She said that if she had this ability, she should use it to help others. She said it might give her father's death some meaning if her gift, learned partly through the grief of losing him, could prevent other families from suffering the same loss. In April 1916, Clara Caldwell moved to St. Louis to work with Dr. Vincent Margolis. It would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. The arrangement began innocently enough. Margolis maintained a small private practice in a respectable neighborhood in St. Louis. Clara lived with a local family, the Hendersons, who had been carefully vetted. She was paid $20 per month, an enormous sum for a 14-year-old girl in 1916, equivalent to several $1,000s today. 3 days per week, Clara would visit Margolis's practice. Patients would come in, and Clara would examine them using her ability. She would describe what she saw to Margolis, who would translate her observations into medical terminology and recommend treatments. The results were remarkable. Clara diagnosed conditions that other physicians had missed. She identified cancers in their early stages. She located internal injuries. She detected heart problems, kidney diseases, neurological disorders. Word spread quickly. Margolis's practice became overwhelmed with patients seeking Clara's services. For the first month, everything seemed legitimate. Then Margolis began making changes. He increased Clara's schedule to 5 days per week, then 6. He raised his fees dramatically, charging desperate patients enormous sums for consultations with the girl who can see the invisible. He began accepting cases from wealthy clients who traveled from across the country, paying premium prices for Clara's diagnoses. Clara wrote to her mother expressing discomfort with the arrangement, but Margolis had structured the contract carefully. Martha had agreed to a 6-month term. Clara was obligated to continue. By June 1916, the situation had evolved into something darker. Margolis began hosting what he called demonstration sessions, events where Clara would examine multiple patients in succession while a paying audience of physicians and medical students watched. He charged admission. He took notes. He talked about publishing a book featuring Clara's most dramatic cases. Clara's letters home became increasingly distressed. She described feeling like a performing animal. She wrote about being exhausted, about having headaches, about the involuntary visions becoming worse again due to the constant exposure to sick people. In a letter dated June 18, 1916, she writes, "Mama, please let me come home. Dr. Margolis is kind enough to me, but I feel like I'm being used. He doesn't care about helping people anymore. He cares about making money and becoming famous." Yesterday, he had me examine 16 people in 4 hours. By the end, I couldn't think straight. I was seeing bones and organs overlapping, like everyone had become transparent at once. I vomited afterward. He gave me medicine that made the headache stop, but made me feel strange and distant. I want to come home. Martha Caldwell contacted Professor Ashcroft immediately. Ashcroft traveled to St. Louis and confronted Margolis. What happened next is documented in legal papers filed in St. Louis County Court. Ashcroft accused Margolis of exploiting a minor, of violating the spirit of their agreement, of causing psychological harm to Clara through overwork. Margolis countered that he had a legally binding contract, that Clara was being well compensated, that he had broken no laws. He threatened to sue if Clara breached the contract, claiming he would seek damages for lost income and harm to his professional reputation. The dispute escalated. Margolis refused to release Clara from the contract. Martha couldn't afford a lawyer. Clara was trapped. What happened next remains one of the most debated aspects of Clara Caldwell's story. The evidence is fragmentary, contradictory, and was clearly suppressed by parties with interests in controlling the narrative. On the night of July 2, 1916, Clara Caldwell disappeared from the Henderson residence where she had been staying. She left no note. She took only a small bag of clothes. The police were notified. An investigation was launched. Dr. Margolis claimed Clara had run away, possibly returning to her family in Missouri. But when authorities checked with Martha Caldwell, she reported that Clara had not come home, and she had no idea where her daughter was. For 3 days, Clara's whereabouts were unknown. Then on July 5th, Clara appeared at the St. Louis train station, accompanied by a woman who identified herself only as a friend. Clara was taken to police headquarters for questioning. She appeared shaken but unharmed. She refused to say where she had been or who had helped her. The only statement she would make was, "I will not return to Dr. Margolis. I will not examine any more patients. I don't care about the contract. I would rather go to jail than continue." The legal situation became incredibly complex. Margolis demanded Clara's return, citing the contract. Martha Caldwell, now represented by a lawyer who had taken the case pro bono after reading about Clara's situation in the newspapers, argued that the contract was exploitative and should be voided. Clara was a minor. She had been overworked. Her welfare had been disregarded in favor of profit. The case attracted significant public attention. Newspapers across the country covered the story. Some portrayed Clara as a victim of a greedy doctor. Others suggested she was an ungrateful child who had broken a legitimate business agreement. A few questioned whether her ability was even real, suggesting the whole affair was an elaborate fraud. The judge assigned to the case, Honorable Marcus Holland, made an unusual decision. Before ruling on the contract dispute, he wanted to verify Clara's ability for himself. He ordered an independent medical examination. On July 20th, 1916, in a closed courtroom, Clara Caldwell underwent the most rigorous testing she had yet experienced. 3 physicians, none of whom had any connection to Margolis or the Caldwell family, conducted examinations. They brought patients with known conditions. They set up elaborate controls to prevent any possibility of fraud. The transcript of this court-ordered examination runs to 127 pages. It has been sealed by court order for over a century, but portions have leaked to researchers over the years. Based on these fragments, Clara's performance during the court examination was extraordinary. She correctly diagnosed 19 of 20 patients presented to her. The one error involved a patient in the very early stages of diabetes, a condition that might have been undetectable even to Clara's remarkable perception. Judge Holland's ruling, issued on July 28, 1916, is preserved in St. Louis County Legal Archives. He voided Clara's contract with Dr. Margolis on the grounds that it constituted exploitation of a minor. He ordered Margolis to pay Clara all wages owed, plus an additional sum as compensation for emotional distress. He issued an order protecting Clara from any further commercial exploitation of her ability until she reached the age of 18. Margolis appealed. The appeal was denied. He attempted to sue Martha Caldwell for damages. That suit was dismissed. Clara returned home to Missouri. She never worked as a medical consultant again. The Clara Caldwell who returned to Taney County in August 1916 was profoundly different from the girl who had left 4 months earlier. She was 15 years old and had experienced more trauma than many people face in a lifetime. Dr. Webb examined her and found her physically healthy but psychologically exhausted. He prescribed rest, normal routines, and time away from anything related to her ability. For several months, Clara withdrew almost completely from public life. She spent her days helping her mother with household tasks, reading, taking long walks in the woods. She avoided people whenever possible. When forced to interact with neighbors, she kept her eyes downcast, refusing to look directly at anyone. Martha Caldwell later told Dr. Webb that Clara had developed a new habit. She would sit in her room with the curtains drawn, in complete darkness, for hours at a time. When asked why, Clara said it was the only time she felt truly blind, truly free from seeing too much. The notoriety from the St. Louis incident gradually faded. By early 1917, as America's entry into World War I dominated public attention, Clara's story slipped from newspaper headlines. The family was largely left alone, but Clara's ability had not diminished. If anything, it had continued to intensify. In a letter to Professor Ashcroft, written in November 1916, Clara describes her condition with heartbreaking clarity. "Professor, you asked me to write to you if anything about my condition changed. I should tell you that it has gotten worse, though I don't know how to explain it properly. I can now see things that I don't think I should be able to see. Not just organs and bones, but smaller things. Tiny structures inside cells. Movements of fluid so small I shouldn't be able to perceive them. Yesterday I looked at a drop of water from our well and I could see things swimming in it. Tiny living creatures that I know from books are too small for the eye to see. But I can see them. When I look at my own blood, I cut my finger on a knife. I can see the individual blood cells moving past each other. I can see my mother's thoughts forming in her brain as electrical patterns of light. I can see death approaching people from weeks away. The old man who lives 3 miles down the valley, Mr. Henderson, I can see that his heart is going to fail soon, within days. I know this with absolute certainty. I don't know what to do with this knowledge. Do I warn him? Do I say nothing? Every choice feels wrong. I am learning things that humans were never meant to know. I am seeing the machinery of life in such detail that life itself has become mechanical, stripped of mystery and beauty. I don't know how to turn it off. I don't know how to be a normal girl anymore. Sometimes I wish I had never developed this ability. Sometimes I wish I could just stop seeing. Forever. Professor Ashcroft was deeply alarmed by this letter. He recognized signs of what we might today call dissociation or depersonalization. a psychological state where reality feels unreal, where the self feels detached from experience. He wrote back immediately, offering to visit, to arrange for Clara to see specialists who might help her develop better coping mechanisms. But before any help could be arranged, Clara's prediction about Mr. Henderson came true. The elderly man died of sudden cardiac failure on November 24, 1916, exactly 6 days after Clara had written about seeing his approaching death. This incident, more than any other, seemed to break something fundamental in Clara's psyche. She had not warned Mr. Henderson. She had said nothing to anyone. And now he was dead. She blamed herself completely. Dr. Webb's medical notes from this period describe Clara as experiencing what he called a crisis of moral responsibility. She was tormented by the question, if she could see death approaching, did she have an obligation to warn people? And if she did warn them, what would that accomplish? Most of the conditions she foresaw were untreatable in 1916. Warning people would only give them time to dread their own deaths. Clara stopped sleeping regularly. Martha would find her daughter standing at the window in the middle of the night, staring out into darkness. When asked what she was doing, Clara would say she was trying to see nothing, trying to force her mind to stop analyzing every shadow, every movement, every sign of life or death in the world around her. In December 1916, Clara made a decision. She announced to her mother that she wanted to attend a regular school, to have a normal life, to be a normal teenager. She wanted to pretend the ability didn't exist. This was easier said than done. Clara had completed only 3rd grade before her ability manifested and disrupted her education. She was years behind academically. But the local school teacher, Miss Sarah Garrett, agreed to tutor Clara privately to help her catch up. For several months in early 1917, Clara devoted herself to studying mathematics, literature, history, geography, subjects that had nothing to do with anatomy or medicine. She threw herself into learning with desperate intensity, as if filling her mind with other knowledge might crowd out the biological information that haunted her. Miss Garrett later recalled that Clara was one of the most dedicated students she had ever taught, but also one of the strangest. She would be reading a history text, completely absorbed, and then suddenly she would close her eyes and press her hands to her temples, as if trying to block something out. When I asked if she was all right, she would say she was fine, but I could see she was in distress. Once I asked her what was wrong, and she said, "I can see your blood pressure rising when you get frustrated with my questions. I can see the stress hormones flooding through your system. I don't mean to, but I see it, and it distracts me from the lesson." How does a teacher respond to that? By May 1917, Clara had caught up sufficiently to be tested for admission to the county high school. She passed the entrance examinations. In September 1917, at age 15, she began attending Forsyth High School as a freshman. It would last 3 months. Clara's attempt at normal school life was doomed from the start. Her reputation had preceded her. Every student in the school knew who she was, the girl who could see through people. Some were fascinated, some were frightened, some were cruel. Classmates would approach her, demanding she tell them if they were sick. They would tease her, asking if she could see what they had eaten for breakfast, if she could see their hearts beating, if she could see them naked under their clothes. The questions were relentless and often deliberately humiliating. Clara tried to ignore them. She tried to focus on her studies, but the social pressure was overwhelming. And there was another problem, one that Clara had not fully anticipated. She couldn't help seeing her classmates' conditions. In a letter to Professor Ashcroft dated October 15th, 1917, Clara describes the torment of sitting in a classroom full of teenagers. Every person around me is like an open book showing me things I don't want to know. The boy who sits behind me in mathematics has a bone infection in his jaw. It's going to get worse. The girl across from me in literature class is pregnant and doesn't know it yet. She's going to discover it in a few weeks, and there will be a terrible scandal. My teacher, Mr. Morrison, has a growth in his throat. It's cancer. He has maybe a year to live. He doesn't know. He thinks his sore throat is from teaching too much. I know I should tell someone, should warn these people, but what would happen? They would think I'm cursed. They would fear me even more than they already do. And what good would it do? I cannot fix any of these things. I can only see them and carry the knowledge like a burden that gets heavier every day. The breaking point came in November 1917. During a history class, a student named Thomas Brennan collapsed. He had been sitting at his desk one moment, and the next he was on the floor, convulsing. The teacher sent for Dr. Webb. The student was rushed to the doctor's office. Thomas Brennan died that afternoon. The cause was determined to be a brain aneurysm. A blood vessel in his brain had ruptured suddenly. Dr. Webb said there was nothing that could have been done. The condition was undetectable and the death was essentially instantaneous once the rupture occurred. But 3 students came forward and told school administrators that Clara had been staring at Thomas during class earlier that morning. One claimed Clara had whispered to another student, "Something's wrong with him." The implication was clear. Clara had seen Thomas's condition and had done nothing to prevent his death. The accusation spread through the school like wildfire. Students began to fear Clara. Some claimed she was cursed, that seeing her was bad luck. Others went further, suggesting she was somehow causing the illnesses and deaths she predicted. The word witch was used, though only in whispers. Clara stopped attending school on November 20th, 1917. She never returned. The winter of 1917-1918 was the lowest point in Clara's life. She became completely reclusive. She refused to leave the farm. She avoided even her own family members as much as possible. Martha became seriously worried that her daughter was losing the will to live. Dr. Webb visited regularly, but there was little he could do. Clara's problem was not physical illness. It was existential despair brought on by an ability she couldn't control and didn't want. Professor Ashcroft maintained correspondence with Clara throughout this period. His letters show a man desperately trying to help someone who was drowning in her own perception. He suggested meditation techniques, concentration exercises, even experimental psychological approaches that were being developed in Europe. Nothing seemed to help. Then in March 1918, something unexpected happened. Clara received a letter from a woman named Dr. Margaret Harrow. Dr. Harrow was a physician working in Boston, one of the first women to practice medicine in Massachusetts. She had read Professor Ashcroft's published reports about Clara, but unlike the curiosity seekers and exploiters who had plagued Clara's life, Dr. Harrow offered something different: understanding. Dr. Harrow's letter explained that she herself possessed an unusual perceptual ability. She could not see through solid objects like Clara, but she had an extraordinary sensitivity to pain in others. She could sense when people were suffering, could feel their pain almost as if it were her own. She described it as being bombarded constantly by the distress of everyone around her. She wrote, "I understand what you're experiencing, though our abilities differ in their specifics. You're not alone in this. There are others like us, people whose perception extends beyond normal human limits. We are not cursed. We are not gifted. We are simply different, and that difference comes with a terrible cost. I have spent years learning to manage my condition. I believe I can help you learn to manage yours. Dr. Harrow offered to host Clara in Boston for several months to work with her privately on developing coping strategies. She promised no exploitation, no publicity, no tests. Just one unusual woman helping another unusual woman learn to live with an ability that set them apart from everyone else. Martha Caldwell was skeptical. Clara had been exploited before. But Dr. Harrow's letter seemed sincere, and Professor Ashcroft had investigated Dr. Harrow's credentials and found them impeccable. More importantly, Clara wanted to go. She said this was the first time anyone had offered to help her without wanting something in return. In April 1918, Clara traveled to Boston. She would remain there for 9 months. What happened during those 9 months is poorly documented. Clara and Dr. Harrow maintained almost complete privacy. The few letters Clara sent home were brief and general. She was safe. She was learning. She was beginning to feel more hopeful. The only detailed account comes from a journal entry Dr. Harrow made years later, which was discovered after her death in 1954. In it, she describes her work with Clara. The girl arrived broken, barely able to function. Her ability had consumed her completely. She could no longer distinguish between normal vision and her enhanced perception. Everything was transparent to her. The world had become an overwhelming assault of biological information. I began by teaching her something I call selective attention, the practice of consciously choosing what to perceive and what to ignore. It's similar to learning to ignore background noise, but infinitely more difficult because what she's filtering is not external noise, but her own enhanced perceptual capabilities. We worked on visualization exercises. I had her imagine closing doors in her mind, one by one, each door blocking a different aspect of her ability. Close the door that shows you the cardiovascular system. Close the door that reveals bone structure. Close the door that makes you see cellular activity. Progress was slow. There were setbacks. Days when she would break down, overwhelmed again. But gradually, over months, she learned. She developed what I can only describe as an internal discipline, the ability to keep her perception contained unless she consciously chose to release it. Clara returned to Missouri in January 1919. She was 17 years old. Her family barely recognized her. She had gained weight. She smiled occasionally. She could look directly at people again without flinching or seeming overwhelmed. Dr. Webb examined her and declared her physically healthy. More importantly, Clara reported that she had regained some control over her ability. She could still see through solid objects and perceive internal conditions when she chose to concentrate, but the involuntary visions had largely stopped. She had learned to filter, to regulate, to exist in the normal world again. But she had also learned something else during her time with Dr. Harrow, that she would never be completely normal, and that trying to be normal had nearly destroyed her. She needed to accept what she was and find a way to live with it on her own terms. Clara made several decisions that spring. First, she would not return to school. The structured environment, the constant proximity to other people was too difficult for her to manage. Instead, she would continue her education through correspondence courses and private tutoring. Second, she would use her ability selectively and on her own terms. If someone she cared about was sick, she would offer to examine them. If a situation arose where her ability could prevent suffering, she would use it. But she would not advertise her services, would not accept payment, would not allow herself to be exploited again. Third, and perhaps most importantly, she would try to live as normal a life as possible in all other respects. She would have friends, hobbies, interests that had nothing to do with medicine or biology. She would read fiction, learn to paint, study music. She would be a person who happened to have an unusual ability, not an ability that happened to be trapped in a person's body. For the next several years, Clara largely succeeded in this goal. She lived quietly on the family farm. She helped her mother with household tasks and with managing the property. She read extensively, often borrowing books from Dr. Webb's personal library. She learned to play the piano. She developed a talent for watercolor painting, particularly landscapes. Neighbors learned to treat her normally. The sensationalism faded. Clara became simply Clara again. A quiet, somewhat strange young woman, but no longer an object of fear or fascination. She used her ability occasionally. Dr. Webb would sometimes consult her on difficult cases, always with the patient's permission and always in private. Clara's diagnoses remained remarkably accurate, but she made it clear that she was helping Dr. Webb as a favor, not as a career. In the fall of 1921, something happened that would test Clara's hard-won equilibrium. A young man named James Whitmore moved to Taney County. He was 24 years old, a veteran of the Great War, a carpenter by trade. He had served in France, been wounded twice, and returned home with what was then called shell shock, what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. James had moved to the Ozarks seeking quiet and isolation to help him recover. He rented a small cabin about 3 miles from the Caldwell farm and took on carpentry work from local farmers. He and Clara met in November 1921, when James was hired to repair the Caldwell family's barn. Clara was 19 years old. James was 24. By all accounts, they fell in love quickly. Martha Caldwell was initially concerned. She worried that Clara's ability would make any romantic relationship impossible. How could you build intimacy with someone when you could literally see inside their body, see every flaw, every weakness, every inevitable decay? But Clara handled it differently than her mother feared. She made a conscious decision. She would never use her ability on James unless it was absolutely necessary. She would love him as any woman loves a man, seeing only what normal vision revealed, knowing only what normal observation taught. James knew about Clara's reputation. Everyone in the county did. He asked her about it directly, early in their relationship. She told him the truth. Yes, she could see inside people's bodies, but no, she wouldn't look at him that way unless he asked her to, or unless his life depended on it. James accepted this. He told her that he had his own demons from the war, his own things he preferred not to examine too closely. They could be two damaged people helping each other heal. They were married on June 3rd, 1922. The wedding was small, family and a few close friends. Dr. Webb gave Clara away in place of her late father. Professor Ashcroft traveled from Columbia to attend, one of the few times he returned to Taney County after the initial testing in 1915. The newlyweds moved into James's cabin. James expanded his carpentry business. Clara kept house, tended a garden, and continued her painting. By outward appearances, they were a normal young couple building a normal life. But beneath that normalcy, tensions existed that would have destroyed most relationships. Clara described it years later in a letter to Dr. Harrow. Living with James means constantly fighting the urge to examine him, to make sure he's healthy, to check for problems before they become serious. Every time he has a headache, I have to resist the impulse to look inside his skull to see if something is wrong. Every time he coughs, I have to stop myself from examining his lungs. It's exhausting. It's like being a recovering alcoholic who lives with bottles of wine in every room. The temptation is always there. But I've learned that relationships require mystery. If I know everything about his body, there's nothing left to discover, nothing left to trust. So I practice discipline. I practice blindness. I practice being a normal wife. Clara and James's marriage worked for several years. They had their difficulties. James's war trauma would surface in nightmares and occasional episodes of severe anxiety, but they developed ways of supporting each other through their respective struggles. In 1924, Clara became pregnant. It should have been a joyous occasion. But for Clara, pregnancy was a unique form of torture. She could see the child developing inside her body, not as a vague sense or intuition, but with the same clarity with which she could see any biological process. She could watch cells dividing. She could see the fetus's heart beginning to beat at just a few weeks. She could observe the formation of organs, the development of the nervous system, the growth of bones. It was beautiful. It was also terrifying. Clara could see every potential problem. Every minor irregularity in development would send her into panic. Was that heart chamber forming correctly? Was the neural tube closing as it should? Why was there a small amount of fluid accumulating in that region? Was it normal, or was it a sign